And it's working. Okay. Good evening, everyone. That's where you get to respond. Yes, I know. Everybody is at the end of the day. We're all tired. It's okay, because we're going to talk about something very exciting. We're going to continue our discussion of kashrut, of keeping kosher. So last week's class, we talked about sort of the nuts and bolt basic, what are the ingredients that are kosher and what are the ingredients that are not kosher. And you may remember, we left off on a bit of a cliffhanger, the topic of meat and milk. And we didn't get into that very much because I had to have something to teach this week. So this week, we're going to look into that at our start. As you're going to see, that simple little commandment of not mixing meat and milk is going to create a whole web of different activities and things that we need to keep track of. So hold on. You remember, we talked about this a little bit. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Is mentioned 3 times in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Exodus again. Remember as well, the word kid is the English word for a baby goat. This is not talking about children, right? We don't eat children at all in any way. Very important. We only guilt them. All right, so as the Shulchan Aruch, Joseph Caro's great law book said, the word kid is not specific, meaning it's not only about baby goats. It is the same rule with ox, sheep, and goats. There is no difference if it's the milk of the mother or another domesticated animal. Rather, the verse refers to the common case. Apparently, cooking a small animal together with the milk from the mother was normal in the ancient world, and so that's why the Torah used that as its example. The same way that when the Torah talks about lost and found objects, it talks about like wandering animals, because that's the kind of thing that was normal to occur. But of course, if someone's bicycle went lost, you'd return that too. Make sense? Okay. Now, 3 times it gets mentioned, which is unusual in the Torah to mention something multiple times. Why is this? Well, the house of Rabbi Eliezer taught, the Torah states, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk 3 times to teach us 3 different things. For the prohibition on eating, for the prohibition on deriving benefit, and for the prohibition of cooking. Meaning, if you cook it, but don't eat it, you've still broken the commandment. If you eat it, but you didn't cook it, you've still broken a commandment. If someone else cooks it, and then you buy it and sell it to another person, you didn't make it and you didn't eat it, but you're benefiting from it, it's still not permitted, right? Which is basically saying, really, 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 don't mix meat and milk. It is something that is apparently a rather serious thing to keep in mind. So because of that, I can use my little mouse here. Because of that, the prohibition on eating is the easy one, generally speaking. That is to say, most of us, if we're paying attention, can avoid accidentally eating a cheeseburger, right? Most of us, if we're paying attention, can avoid putting meat on our pizza. If there's a big piece of cheese and a big piece of meat, we don't usually accidentally get them into our mouth at the same time. The same thing with deriving benefit. Most of the time, we're not in the business of buying, selling Philly cheesesteaks. So what is actually going on here? I should point out, by the way, for those of you who do work in the food industry, the principle of meat and milk only applies to kosher meat and kosher milk. So if you do happen to work at a Subway sandwich, they're not selling kosher meat, so you don't have to worry. You can actually sell whatever they've got, and you're not violating this commandment. As someone who used to work at Subway, that was good to know. All right, but that last one, cooking. Cooking seems tricky. Now you might think, but cooking and eating, what's the difference? Well, welcome to Material Science 101. Judaism believes that what we cook with matters as much as the ingredients we clearly put in. How do we know this? Well, Book of Numbers 31 talks about when the Israelites have gathered in different containers from some of the people who had attacked us. We get their pots and pans from the army that attacked us, that we need to make them suitable for our use. The gold, the silver, the copper, the iron, the tin, and the lead, whatever is used in fire, you shall pass through fire, and then it will be clean. By the way, Do not eat with lead material nowadays. Not a good idea. It must, however, also be cleansed with sprinkling water, and whatever is not used in fire, you shall pass through water. These short little sentences are giving us a basic understanding that if you use a particular item in fire, you have to clean it with fire. If you use an item not with fire, you clean it with water. More detail to follow. Some materials, therefore, are harder or easier to make new again. We call this re-koshering, right? To make something kosher again. So the breakdown from our previous verses goes like this. Things that are clay pots or plates, things that are made out of, excuse me, let me just make sure that's not a technical issue. Things that are made out of the natural clay pottery kind of things. Once those have been used, you can never return it to its original empty state, to its clean state. So, for example, I'm trying to think of anything that anyone actually uses that are these now. I remember one. Someone very nicely gave us a little clay pot that you could cook garlic in. It was like a little clay container, and you put the garlic whole clove in it, and you put a bunch of olive oil in there, you put a lid on it, you put it in the oven, bam, you get beautiful, soft little bits of garlic you can suck right out of the garlic. It's wonderful. That, if it touches meat, becomes a meat pot, and you can never undo that. It will stay a meat pot for the rest of its existence. If you put a little bit of milk in there, it becomes a milk pot, and it stays a milk pot forever. What's the issue here? Well, the issue, as we're going to see, is about absorption. Absorption and release. If you've ever had a loving child make for you a cup out of clay when they were in kindergarten, and then you brought it home and you fill it up with coffee, what is that mug going to smell like for the rest of its life? Coffee. No matter how much you scrub it, it is going to smell like coffee. Why? Because clay isn't really solid. Clay has tiny little holes everywhere, all around it. That's why if you ever have like a clay pot with a plant and you pour water into the pot, the whole pot is going to start changing color and get darker because the water is sinking into the walls of the pot. So clay basically is like a sponge. And that means that whatever you put in it becomes that pot's status, and there is no way to undo that. We're good so far? All right. Glass, on the other hand, can be rekoshered, can be returned to a neutral state just by washing it with water. Right? Why? Because glass is a perfectly smooth and impenetrable surface. That's why we use glass in laboratories. It's why doctors use glass. And if somebody is getting a tube, for doing a test and doing their laboratory work, they're not going to use a clay tube. They're not going to use even a metal tube. They're going to use a glass tube because the glass doesn't absorb any of the stuff that goes into it. That makes sense, right? We're good? Okay. It's the other stuff that's complicated. The metal, the wood, the stone, heat-resistant plastics. These things can be rekoshered, but they each have a particular way of being rekoshered, according to that verse that we saw from the book of Numbers. Everyone with me so far? Okay, and the basic rule is, oops, that's not what I wanted to go. Sorry, the basic rule is, Kiv olo kach polto. I'll read Rabbi Huna's words himself. Son of Rabbi Yehoshua said, a wooden ladle should be purged in boiling water in a primary vessel. He holds, as it absorbs, so it ejects. You may remember back in the book of Numbers where it said, if it's used in fire, you have to clean it with fire. Why? Because the hotter the temperature is, the more open the material becomes, and that means the deeper it absorbs. And to get it to get rid of that material, you have to heat it back up again the same way. So are you following the logic here? All right, so if I have a hot metal pan, then if I need to heat it back up to the original temperature it was when it first absorbed, in order for it to expel anything that was inside of it. And that's going to be the general rule. Depending on how the cooking tool was heated, we know how to make it kosher. But before we get to that, we have to have a few basic rules before you're going to re-kosher anything that needs to be made kosher. First, once you've finished using it, you clean it, right? Which you probably all do your dishes every day anyway, right? Everybody does their dishes. Good. After you've used it, you clean it. Once you have cleaned it, you leave it unused for 24 hours. This is because that means anything left inside of it after 24 hours is no longer considered acceptable as food. It's no longer considered to be a beneficial flavoring ingredient. So when it starts spitting the stuff out, we don't have to worry about it. And then you do the appropriate koshering treatment that we're talking about. Now, this means that if you have something that has never been used for cooked foods, let's say you have your ice cream scoop, right? All I've ever done with my ice cream scoop is scoop ice cream. It's never gone above 32 degrees in its entire life. Well, that means that it has never absorbed any flavors of any of the ice creams. Technically, don't do this, but technically, I could take my ice cream scoop, if it's nice and clean and nothing on it, and I could rub it up and down a piece of meat, tenderize it with the meat, and that would be okay. Please don't. It's better to make sure you keep things separate, but technically you wouldn't have contaminated the meat with the ice cream because the ice cream scoop never got hot, it never absorbed. Now, there's one other category and way that things can absorb. Judaism also recognizes certain sharp foods that are harif, like onions, for example, or very hot chilies. Those are also considered, because of their acidity, to open up the material and absorb. But most things, if you're cold, are not absorbing. We're good so far? Okay, so let's get to the particulars. Hag'alah. This is the way we kosher many things. Most stovetop pots, your basic saucepan, most cooking and serving utensils, the tongs that you use, the spoon that you stir your soups with, those kinds of things. Most knives, most forks, spoons, all these kinds of things. This is how we make them kosher. Take a kosher pot or a brand new pot. You can also take a pot and make it kosher in this way. You fill it up with water. So far, so good. Put it on the stove and bring it up to a roiling boil, right? That means the water should really be going. Be careful, right? Oven gloves are a must for this. Take the item, stick it into the pot for a little bit, about 10 seconds or so, take it out. If it's too big to go into the pot all at once, you can take it out, turn it around, put the other part back in. Boom. It is now kosher. That's it. It's easy. By the way, this is very important to keep in mind because this is something that you'll also need to do for anything that you want to use during Passover. Because on Pesach, we have to make sure that we don't have chametz, which we will talk about when we get into our Passover unit in a week or two. We good? All right. Objects that have parts that cannot be reached to be cleaned cannot be kosher. If there are giant cracks and crevices, for example, in your spoons, get a new spoon, right? If there's no way to get all the way inside the item, then you're just gonna have to replace it. Things that are, for example, sometimes have like those rolled metal edges. Sometimes those metal edges are tight, but a little cracked. And that means something could have gotten in, but you can't be sure the hot water got in. And again, you're just gonna replace it. You with me so far? Okay. Libun, this is the more dramatic version. Ovens, grills, like your barbecue, baking trays, and other items used in fire directly or in an oven directly need the process of libun. This can be done with a blowtorch, which is very exciting and dramatic, and it makes the metal hot enough that it's actually glowing. This is the way most people will do a barbecue, for example. However, except for grills, roasting spits, and the like, actual barbecue kind of things, libun kal is also okay. That means that you can heat an oven to 550 degrees, leave it like that for an hour. Most ovens will have a self-cleaning cycle that does that for you. And boom, you didn't even know it, but GE is helping you be kosher. Now, why are only grills, roasting spits, and those kinds of things? Well, because those are the kind of things that we use directly over a naked flame. Right? If you have your barbecue grill and there's actual fire coming up, then you need to use actual fire to make it kosher again. But most of us in our ovens at home, we don't have fire exposed inside of our oven, big gouts of flame shooting up onto our cookie rack. Make sense? Okay. Irui for all your other needs. Countertops, sinks, those kinds of surfaces where we don't actually usually cook on them or with them, but we still sometimes put hot things on them. So maybe you take the loaf of bread out of the oven and you throw it on the countertop. The countertop isn't really cooking it. The loaf of bread is cooking the countertop. It's kind of a very secondary form of heat. For those, we just pour boiling water over the surface. And that is good enough. And clean up the water, please. And be very careful. Boiling water is hot, in case you weren't sure. You with me all the way here? All right. So why is this important? And why are we talking about this specifically with the meat and milk section? Because contamination, right? Everybody's talking about this now because of the coronavirus, but we've been talking about contamination for a very, very long time. What this means is, imagine you have your lovely pot and you cook your chicken soup in the pot. The pot gets hot. The pot absorbs some of the chicken into the walls of the pot. It embeds it inside the little tiny holes in the metal. And then you stop cooking. The pot cools down, and then you want to make some lovely sauce for a pasta that you're going to have tomorrow. And that is going to be a dairy sauce. And you accidentally pour some milk into that pot. You turn the heat up. What happened? Well, the pot releases the chicken into the dairy, into the milk, and the pot absorbs some of the milk into its walls. So now in the pot and in the walls of the pot, you have a mixture of meat and milk. That's our problem. So that's why we want to sometimes re-kosher things, because sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes there are these accidental mix-ups. Most people nowadays are lucky enough to be able to own 2 pots rather than only 1 pot. And that means you can have 1 pot you use for meat and 1 pot you use for dairy. 1 set of plates you use for meat, 1 set of plates you use for dairy, 1 set of forks, 1 set of knives, and you have these just 2 separate groups, which is why Jewish people always want more cupboard space in their kitchens when they're looking for an apartment or a house. But sometimes accidents will still happen, no matter how careful you've been, no matter how clearly you've labeled this with red and that with blue to make it clear which one's which. Sometimes you're still going to have problems. It's not always the end of the world. This is from Rambam in his section about forbidden foods, and he explains, it is only when meat and milk become mixed together through cooking, right, with heat, that they become forbidden. When a hot object falls onto a hot object, or when a cold object fell into a hot object. Those are the only time when we actually have a problem. If, however, what is hot fell into another thing when it's cold, remove the surface of the meat, which touched the milk, and the remainder can be eaten. Now, just you have to imagine this. I know all of you are very careful in your kitchens, but you are eating your hot dog, and you accidentally drop it into your bowl of cereal, right? And it goes into the milk. Blech, right? What do you have to do? You pull the hot dog out, you scrape off the surface of the hot dog, the part that touched the milk, and you're good. Because it was only the surface that came into contact with the milk, therefore only the surface is a problem. Now, is that what most people would do nowadays? I would imagine no. Most people would probably just throw the hot dog away. But that's because we are blessed, right? We can go down to the supermarket and we can buy more hot dogs quite cheaply, right? Hebrew National, very tasty. But if you lived 200, 300 or more years ago, meat was very, very important and very, very valuable. And there was no refrigerator, there was no Publix, there was no way to get extra meat. And so you would want to save as much of the meat as you could from this catastrophe that just happened in your kitchen. So the rules as people use them now, people can tend to be a little stricter now because we're richer than our ancestors used to be. No matter how poor any of us is here, trust me, we're all richer than almost everybody who ever lived on Earth. But these are the official rules. Part two, if cold fell into cold, right? You have your cold piece of meat and you drop it into your bowl of milk, right? Cold milk, cold meat. You have to wash the piece of meat thoroughly, and then it can be eaten. You take and pull your bit of, brisket out of the milk, and you go, what an idiot I am. Wash it under the sink. Boom. You can now cook it. You can eat it. It's fine. All right. For this reason, it is permitted for meat and milk to be carried together in a single wrap, if they do not touch each other. If they do touch, wash the meat and wash the cheese, and then you can eat both of them. Now, when I was first learning how to keep kosher, unfortunately, a lot of people who tried to explain it to me did not start with Rambam. They started with paranoia. And there were people who said, in your refrigerator, you have to have one section for meat and one section for dairy, and the meat section has to be below the dairy, because if the meat drips onto the dairy, no, right? There are people out there who buy 2 refrigerators. One for meat, one for dairy, one freezer, one for meat, one for... It is totally unnecessary. Yes, don't take a naked piece of cheese and throw it into the freezer on top of a naked piece of meat. That's not a good idea. But it's not a good idea even if you're not Jewish, right? You should always be wrapping your food. So you do not need to be crazy or paranoid to keep kashrut. You just need to be a little careful around your kitchen. And trust me, once you get your kitchen set up so that you know what pot's meat, what pot's dairy, it happens very, very easily, and it doesn't require too much stress, just mindfulness. And that's the whole point. Well, one of the whole points of kashrut is that we are being mindful about what we are eating, that we are choosing what we make and how we make it in a way that means we're not just walking through life like an animal that just eats whatever's in front of it. Right? We think before we eat. It's another reason why, as we talked about a few weeks ago, we say blessings before we eat. It's a whole process of raising us above being just an animal beast going through life without any consciousness of our deeds. Okay, but there can be other mix-ups, and so I'll go through some of these. Accidental uses or splashes can happen even when you are being careful. Most are not the end of the world. Meat stew, stirred with dairy spoon, not used in the last 24 hours, right? I've got my meat, I grab a spoon, I accidentally grab the spoon that's supposed to be only for dairy, and I stir it. Now this spoon I hadn't used for more than a day. What happens? Well, the stew is okay, right? You take the spoon out, you go, I'm an idiot. You wash the spoon, you're fine, but you can still eat the dish. You can still eat the soup. Everyone with me on that? Good. Meat stew stirred with a dairy spoon that you had used recently, right? It's the same spoon you used to cook your milky scrambled eggs this morning. So it's less than a day old. You take the same spoon, you stir the stew, right? And if the part that you dipped in, meaning the area of the spoon, is less than 1/60th of the volume of the soup, the stew is okay. And the spoon you have to make kosher again, using the techniques we talked about before, depending upon the material of the spoon. Right? Glass spoon, just wash it. Metal spoon, do it with the dipping in the boiling water, and so on. Make sense? Right? And if not, meaning if the spoon, maybe the soup was just a little bit of soup and the spoon is a really big spoon, so it's not less than 1/60th, then the soup, the actual food, you got to throw it away. Right? Now it has become cross-mixed and you can't eat that. But both the stew pot and the spoon have to go through the re-koshering process like we talked about on the earlier slides. Still with me? Anybody running for the door? Okay. Trust me, this comes up maybe like once a year as a problem in a house. It's not something that comes up very often. The thing that does come up every often is, you said I'm not allowed to eat meat with milk. what does that mean when they're not together? Does that mean I can take a bite of my hot dog and then take a bite of cheese? Does that mean I can eat my hot dog and then have ice cream? Does that mean I can eat my hot dog and then I have to wait 9 months before I eat my cheese? How much gap does there need to be between eating the meat and having something that's dairy? That's the question. So here is what the actual Talmud says about this. Rav Chisda said, one who eats meat isn't allowed to eat cheese. One who eats cheese is allowed to eat meat. So if you eat dairy first, it's not a problem. If you eat meat first, we have a problem. Why is that? Rav Aha Bar Yosef said to Rav Chisda, the meat is between the teeth. What do we make of it? Right? We reference this from the verse, Numbers 11, the meat was still between their teeth. So what's wrong with meat? Well, before the days of toothbrushes and flossing and toothpicks and all of the other things that we have, and even now still today, if you eat a nice piece of stringy meat, the meat gets stuck in between your teeth. Whereas if you eat a piece of cheese, the cheese it dissolves. It's not going to be stuck between your teeth for hours and hours and hours. So the reason why meat is more difficult if you eat it first is because the meat gets stuck in your teeth. So onward, Mar Ukva said, in comparison to my father regarding this matter, I am vinegar the son of wine, which is basically a way of saying my dad was great, I'm not so great. Why? My father, when he ate meat, would not eat cheese until the same time the next day. But even I won't eat it at this meal. I'll eat it at the next meal. So what is Mar Ukva saying? He's saying my father was so careful that he would wait a whole day between eating meat and eating cheese. But me, I wait between one meal and the next meal. And that has become the general rule in our modern times, which is to wait between one meal and the next meal. But of course, what's the obvious question? How long is that? How long is it between one meal and the next meal? Right? Is there a special magic number? Right? Does a little bell go off and then I know it's a new meal time? Well, stay tuned. So this is now, we're in Shulchan Aruch. There are those who say that he doesn't have to wait 6 hours, but rather immediately, if he finishes the meal and says the concluding blessing, it is permissible after wiping and rinsing his mouth. So what he is saying is there are people, and we'll look at this in more detail in a second, that say, look, if you finish the meal, meaning you actually stopped eating and you clean your mouth out, then you can eat the cheese right away. But in his day, in his community, they would wait 6 hours. So now we have our brackets. We have some people who say, I'll wait 6 hours, and some people who say, I'll wait long enough to finish the meal and clean my mouth. You see the two sides of the length? Good. He goes on to say, the simple custom in our countries is to wait after eating meat 1 hour and to eat cheese afterwards. But you have to say the concluding blessings after the meat, because then it's like a new meal. If he finds meat between his teeth after the hour, he has to pull it out. Right? So if you go by his sort of middle position, it's wait an hour. And after you've waited an hour, if there's still something between your teeth, then yeah, get the floss out and, get it out. But then, yes, you are fine. As long as you said a blessing after the meat, which finished the meal. Then the new meal, made with a new blessing, is a new meal, even if it's only an hour later. So what is the definition of a meal? A meal is when you sit down to eat and you bracket it with blessings, right? It is when you are thankful for what is before you. And if you wait an hour and then you're thankful again for something new, that's great. That's a new meal, right? You don't say it's the same meal because it's under the same time. It's the different meal with different blessings. But the rule of thumb for him is waiting an hour. I just want to remind you some of these other texts because some people get very confused about this. Like I said, many people will say to this day, you have to wait 6 full hours. That's not exactly what Judaism has said for most of its history. So we saw Tosafot, very important commentaries on the Talmud from the Middle Ages. At the next meal I'll eat not just at the meal that is customary, one in the morning, one in the evening, which were 6 hours apart. Rather, even immediately, if you clear the table and make the concluding blessing, it is permissible, since the rabbis didn't differentiate. They didn't care what time it was. They only wanted to care what you were doing to make the meal. And so too the Tur, one of the great law codes of the Middle Ages, wrote, the Bahag, the guy who came before him, writes that one who eats meat can eat dairy immediately as long as there is wiping and washing of the hands. Okay, so what does that mean? Before I get that up and confuse you, well, what does that mean for us? It means pick. If you want to wait 6 hours, wait 6 hours, make sure your mouth is clean and there is no meat, and you're fine. If you want to wait 3 hours, which a lot of people in America do, wait 3 hours, make sure your mouth is clean, and you're fine. If you want to wait 1 hour, that's fine. Wait 1 hour, make sure your mouth is clean, and you're good. If you want to finish the meal, rinse your mouth, floss it really well, make sure you said your blessing, and then 10 minutes later eat something else, that is also permissible. Right? There is a whole range of options that at different points would be common in one community or another. Now that we live in the modern world where all the communities have been mixed up together, we don't have just one community thing that everyone has to do. Now, if you're cooking in my kitchen, you'll follow my rules. And if you cook in the synagogue kitchen, you'll follow the synagogue rules. But when you eat for yourself, choose a standard. And for those of you that are still exploring and learning your Judaism, you can experiment with different standards to see which one makes you most mindful, which one allows you to have a tighter connection, which one makes you feel more like you are observing the commandment. But recognize that your choice could change as you're still learning, and also that your choice doesn't have to be everyone else's choice. Make sense? Okay. Let's get biological. The sciatic nerve, the Gid HaNashe. What? Okay, this is the side of your thigh. Let me come around over here so people can see a bit better. I think that's here, right? It's a nerve that controls all the muscles that go down your leg. I'm taking a picture of my leg. I don't think I've ever had anyone take a picture of my leg. Okay, so why is this an issue? Why are we not allowed to eat this? Well, back in Genesis 32, we had this guy named Jacob. And Jacob got into a fight. And he got into a fight with this unusual being, maybe an angel. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, meaning when this angel couldn't defeat Jacob, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. That is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. So, because Jacob had this encounter, we do not eat this portion of the meat that comes off of the animal. Well, specifically off of land animals. Birds, it's okay. Why? What are we supposed to get from this? Because this seems rather unusual. So, Sefer HaChinuch, a great explanation of all the different mitzvot, not that everyone agrees with everything he says, but everything he says is worth reading, has the following lengthy, so hopefully you'll bear with me, explanation. For the roots of this mitzvah are to serve as an indication to Israel that though they will suffer many oppressions and exile by the nations and the descendants of Esau, they should trust that they will not perish, but rather that their descendants and name will stand firm forever and their Redeemer will come. Right? When we refrain, when we choose not to eat this part of the animal, we are making a statement about our faith that even though we are wrestling, even though we are under often a lot of strain, we will still be able to win in the end, the same way that Jacob was able to win in the end. Right? And continually remembering this idea through the mitzvah, they will stand firm in their faith and righteousness forever, as this stems from the fact that the angel who fought with Yaakov, our forefather, who, according to tradition, was the guardian angel of Esau, wished to eliminate Yaakov, Jacob, from the world, he and his descendants, but could not get the better of him and pained him in injuring his thigh. Right? So that whole drama of the angel fighting Jacob, that is Jewish history in one little slice. And because of the symbolism of that Jewish history, we change what we put on the menu. And when we choose from the menu, we are remembering this part of Jewish history. And likewise, Esau's descendants, meaning the people nowadays who come from the same style of life as Esau, which is violent and mean, pain Yaakov's descendants, right? Esau's kids are still troubling Jacob's kids. The people who want to live by pain and force and might, they're still making life difficult for us. It's still going on. We're still wrestling. But in the end, they, meaning the children of Israel, will be saved. As we find with respect to our ancestor that the sun shone to heal him and he was saved from pain, so will the Son of the Messiah shine, and he will heal us from our pain and redeem us speedily in our days. Amen. Right? So these little choices about what we're eating and how we butcher our animals and how we think about what we choose to eat, these all have spiritual levels to them that allow us to transform what is a very basic function of putting food in our mouth into something that can be as meaningful as prayer. Also, there are forbidden fats. That is to say, there are certain fats along the belly of the land animals that were used just for the altar. As it says in Leviticus 7, "Speak to the Israel people thus, you shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goats," specifically a particular type of fat. Fat from animals that died or when torn by beasts may be put to any use. Fat was very useful for many other purposes, but you must not eat it. If anyone eats the fat of animals from which offerings by fire may be made to the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off from his kin. So there are certain fats that a butcher will remove when they slaughter the animal and before it gets to your table. If you were going to be slaughtering your own animals, we'll talk more about how you can identify these and how you can handle it. But nowadays, just know that when you go to cook, when you buy the kosher meat, these pieces of fat have already been removed. The rest of the fat in the meat, if there's extra fat on the edges and all of that, that's all okay. Everyone good on this? Right? And a little fat is okay. You know, one of the upshots of keeping kosher is that most Jewish people eat less red meat than many other people, which on the whole is probably for a healthier diet. So let me move over here so I can point. That's a cow, in case you weren't sure. And it's labeled kosher and non-kosher because beginning in the late Middle Ages, it just became easier for most of the Jewish butchers who lived in Europe to say, getting rid of the fats, getting rid of that nerve and all the muscle around it, that's a lot of work, right? That takes time. And time in business is money. So instead, what the butchers would do was they would cut the cow in half. And they'd sell the back half of the cow to their Christian neighbors next door. That way they didn't have to worry about all the surgery involved. They could just cut it and sell it. And then keep the front half for their Jewish customers. Now, this didn't work in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, the Muslims said, wait a minute, what's wrong with the back of the cow? Why are you getting rid of the back of the cow? And so the Jews who lived in the Muslim world, the Sephardi and Mizrahi communities, butchers still would remove the nerve and remove the fats. They would still take care of that. But in the European world, most of the time, for the last 500 years almost, it was pretty much only the front of the cow that was becoming common, which is why what is one of the most famous choice cuts of meat you get on Pesach or Rosh Hashanah? The brisket. No one else eats the brisket. I mean, nowadays it's a bit more popular, but for a long time it was like a Jewish cut of meat. Why? Because if you don't have the round, or the sirloin, or the loin, or the flank, the brisket's about as good as you're going to get. Right? It's like one of the best cuts of meat from the front of the cow. All the better cuts of meat are on the back. Right? That's why you want to go to a kosher Sephardi restaurant when you go to Israel, because they'll get you the better meat. So, little tip for when you're visiting and you can see that. And in America, almost all the meat you're going to buy is still going to come from the front half of the cow, because nowadays, even more, it's just easier to cut the animal in half after it's been slaughtered properly and sell the back half to a non-kosher butcher in the next building. Everyone with me? Okay. Which brings us up one more time to how do I know the meat I'm getting is kosher? Because who here actually has a cow? No one? Anyone have a sheep? Goat? No. And if you did, I make you bet you weren't going to kill it and eat it. It'd probably be a pet, right? Maybe you have a chicken, but even then, if you have a chicken, I bet you're just going to eat its eggs. You're not planning to actually make chicken soup out of a chicken that's living at your house. So that means almost everybody would have to go to a butcher. But in Orlando, and in fact, most American cities, there aren't real butchers that take a whole chunk of cow and cut it into pieces to then serve to the customers. Most of that's done now by the main slaughterhouse. Well, how do I know the main slaughterhouse is actually kosher? It could just be somebody who, put the word rabbi in front of his name. Well, that's why we have organizations, and these are some of the most common symbols of them, that will visit the slaughterhouses, that will supervise what they do, and will ensure that what they are doing meets all the different requirements of Jewish kosher rules. And then, if they meet the requirements, they are allowed to put the symbol on the packaging. So, when you want to buy kosher meat, you look for one of these on the packages. And as I think I mentioned last week, but I'll say it again, locally, if you're in this area of Orlando, the closest place to get a decent selection of kosher meat is the Winn-Dixie in Fern Park. It's just down the 1792. If you were coming from here, you'd be going down the 1792, you go over the flyover, over the 436, and before the 414, you don't go that far, there's a Winn-Dixie with a Goodwill next door to it, and a Baskin & Robbins in the parking lot. On the right-hand side, they, in their back, have quite a nice kosher selection. One of the families that belongs to the Jewish Academy has worked with them now for a number of years to have a pretty good-sized kosher section, including fresh kosher meat, that is to say prepackaged kosher meat. I think someone's just tuning their car up outside. And they also have many other kosher products. It's also a good place in the coming month to get Passover supplies, because as we'll talk about when we cover Passover, keeping Passover can be a little tricky depending upon how you want to do it. So you're going to want to stock up on a few things before the holiday hits. And I will brief you on all of that when we get to our Passover unit. Okay. Any other questions for tonight? Any other questions, not about Kashrut, but other questions that you've just been dying to ask? But usually we're bumping up right on 7 o'clock and I don't have a minute to spare. But do remember, you can always email, call, text, or other questions anytime. All right, you're all stunned and hungry, so I will let you go, and I will see you next week.